The tea had gone lukewarm by the time I realized neither of them had looked at me in 40 minutes. We were sitting in the dining room, the one with the pale willow pattern wallpaper I'd spent 3 weekends hanging myself, while Calvin was away on a road trip. It was a room built for family Sunday roasts, for passing gravy boats and asking about the coming week. But tonight, it felt like a cold waiting room. My son, Mitchell, sat opposite his stepfather, his thumbs tracing the seam of his jeans under the table over and over until the denim must have been warm from the friction. Calvin sat at the head, his heavy silver-plated watch clicking against the edge of the oak table every time he shifted his weight. "You should have taken the bypass," Calvin said. His voice was flat, dry as cedar. It was the same tone he used when he told me the gutters needed cleaning, or when he remarked that the milk was 2 days past its date. "The bypass has construction," Mitchell replied. He didn't look up. His shoulders were hunched, his jaw tight enough that I could see the muscle pulsing near his ear. "I don't like being boxed in." "You get boxed in because you don't plan," Calvin said. It was an old argument, or at least, it sounded like one. For 12 years, since Mitchell was 15 and Calvin first moved his heavy oak dresser into my bedroom, this had been their language. A series of small, grating remarks about traffic, lawn maintenance, and grease traps. I had spent those 12 years stepping between them, offering more potatoes, changing the subject to the weather, or laughing too loudly at jokes that weren't funny, just to dilute the acid in the air. I believed I was the bridge. I believed that if I just kept my weight firmly in the center, the two ends of my life wouldn't pull apart. But tonight, my back was aching from 3 hours of standing at the pharmacy counter where I worked, and the silence that followed Calvin's comment felt different. It didn't feel like anger. It felt like an old, heavy weight that had settled into the floorboards. I reached for Calvin's plate, which still had 3 cold baby potatoes rolling around in the grease. "Let me take that, Cal. I'll put the kettle on." He didn't let go of the fork. His thumb remained pressed against the silver handle, holding the plate down. He didn't look at me. His eyes remained fixed on Mitchell, who had finally raised his head to stare back. "Leave it, Lorraine," Calvin said quietly. "We're not finished." "You haven't eaten the potatoes," I said, my voice small, almost apologetic. It was a habit I hated, this tendency to apologize for the space I occupied in my own kitchen. "They'll get hard." I said, "Leave it." The words weren't loud, but they had the dull, heavy thud of a cellar door closing. Mitchell's eyes flickered to me, just for a second, before returning to his stepfather. In that brief glance, there was no appeal for help. There was no, "Mom, tell him to back off." There was only a cold, dry calculation. Mitchell was 27 now, with the same lean frame as his biological father, but he had Calvin's stillness. He had learned it here, in this house, while I was busy dusting the baseboards and pretending we were a family. I took my hands off the plate and sat back down. My fingers felt cold. A woman can spend half her life smoothing down the edges of her home, believing she is preventing a fire, only to realize the walls have been charcoal all along. I had spent so much energy worrying about Mitchell's resentment toward the man who replaced his father. I had listened to Mitchell's teenage door slams, his quiet absences, his refusal to join us for Christmas dinners. I had assumed it was the classic, painful friction of a blended home. But as I watched them now, under the yellow glare of the chandelier, I realized they didn't look like 2 men who hated each other. They looked like 2 partners in a business that had gone terribly wrong, waiting to see who would break first. "The roof on the shed is leaking," Mitchell said, his voice dropping an octave. "I know," Calvin said. It's going to rot the joists. If the timber goes, the whole back wall will slide into the creek." "Then let it slide," Calvin said, his fingers finally releasing the fork. It clattered against the porcelain with a sharp, metallic ring. "There's nothing in there you need anymore." Mitchell's eyes narrowed. "There's plenty in there." "Only what you left behind," Calvin said. The silence returned, thicker this time. I looked between them, my chest tightening with a strange, hollow discomfort. The shed at the back of our property was a small, gray structure built from damp pine, mostly used for storing Calvin's old lawnmower and the winter tires. Mitchell hadn't lived here in 6 years. Why would he care about the joists? Why would he care if the back wall slid into the creek? When Mitchell finally stood up to leave, he didn't kiss my cheek. He rarely did anymore. He said my perfume made him sneeze, though it was the same lavender water I'd used since he was a boy. He just nodded toward the stove. "Thanks for the chicken, Mom," he said, his hand already on the strap of his canvas duffel bag. He always carried that bag. Even when he came over for a quick dinner, he never left it in the hallway. It sat by his feet like a dog that might bite if anyone else touched it. "Drive safe, Mitch," I said. "The fog is coming off the river." "I know how to drive the river road," he said. Calvin didn't get up to show him out. He sat at the table, his fingers tapping a slow, irregular rhythm against his water glass. Only when the heavy front door clicked shut did he let out a long, dry breath that smelled of stale meat and the menthol lozenges he sucked for his throat. "He's getting thin," Calvin remarked to the wall. "He's working long hours at the lumber yard," I said, gathering the plates. My hands were steady, but my mind was retracing the evening, searching for the moment the air had turned cold. "He looks tired." "He's not tired," Calvin said, standing up. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered but slightly bent now by a hip that gave him trouble in the damp weather. "He's just stubborn, runs in his blood." He walked toward the hallway, his slippers scuffing against the linoleum. I stood by the sink, the hot water running over my wrists, watching his reflection in the dark kitchen window. He didn't go to the living room to watch the evening news as he always did. Instead, he stopped by the small window in the pantry that faced the backyard. The yard was dark, the grass overgrown because Calvin had refused to let me hire the neighbor's boy to mow it this summer. At the far end, past the overgrown blackberry brambles, the silhouette of the old pine shed stood against the graying sky. Calvin stood there for 5 minutes, completely still, his forehead nearly touching the glass. I turned off the faucet. The sudden silence in the kitchen was so sharp it made my ears ring. I dried my hands on the tea towel, my heart beating with a slow, heavy rhythm that felt less like fear and more like the beginning of a long-delayed draft. "Calvin?" I called out softly. He didn't move. He didn't turn around. He just kept staring out into the dark, toward the wet timber and the rising fog. "Did you give Mitchell that key?" I asked. It was a question that had been sitting at the back of my throat for months, ever since I found a brass key with a notched head in the pocket of Calvin's work jacket while doing the wash. It wasn't the key to our front door or his truck. It looked like the small, old-fashioned keys they used for the padlock on the shed. For a long time, he didn't answer. The grandfather clock in the hall ticked, once, twice, 10 times. "He didn't ask for a key," Calvin said, his voice barely louder than the hum of the refrigerator. "He doesn't need one." He finally turned away from the window, his eyes shadowed in the dim light of the pantry. He looked at me, really looked at me, for the first time all evening. There was no affection in his face, but there was no anger either. There was only a dry, patient exhaustion that looked exactly like my own. "Go to bed, Lorraine," he said. You've got the early shift tomorrow." I didn't go to bed. I sat on the edge of the mattress in the guest room, the room I'd started sleeping in 3 years ago when Calvin's snoring became too heavy to bear, and listened to the house. I listened to the floorboards creaking as Calvin moved through the hallway. I listened to the back door open, the faint click of the latch, and the slow, heavy crunch of his boots on the gravel driveway. He wasn't going to the truck was parked out front. He was walking toward the back. The glass of the guest room window was cold against my temple. Outside, the fog had crawled up from the creek, swallowing the bottom of the blackberry bushes until they looked like dark islands floating in gray wool. Through the haze, I saw the pale yellow beam of Calvin's penlight. He didn't walk with his usual heavy, dragging limp. In the dark, his movements were deliberate, almost stealthy. He reached the door of the pine shed and stopped. He didn't use a key to open the heavy brass padlock. Instead, he reached up, his large, calloused hand grasping the lock itself. He gave it 3 firm tugs, checking its weight, ensuring the steel shackle was seated deep in the iron hasp. Then he did something that made my breath catch against the pane. He leaned his forehead against the damp, rotting wood of the door. He stood there for a full minute, motionless, like a man listening to a heartbeat through a wall. 100 yards away, out on the county road past our tree line, a pair of headlights flickered through the birch trees. The engine was low, a wet, rattling idle I'd know anywhere. It was Mitchell's old Ford diesel. He hadn't gone back to his apartment in town. He was parked in the gravel turnout near the old concrete bridge, the engine running in the dark, just waiting. Calvin didn't turn his flashlight toward the road. He didn't have to. He stood by the shed door, his hand still resting on the lock, until the headlights flickered twice and died. The low rumble of the diesel engine stopped, leaving only the sound of the dripping fog in the yard. I pulled the wool blanket tighter around my shoulders. My husband and my son were communicating in the dark, using a language of silences and headlight flashes that I had never been taught. The next morning, the pharmacy was quiet. The fluorescent lights hummed a steady, flat B-flat that always made my skull ache by noon. I was counting out 60 white pills of lisinopril from Mrs. Gable, the spatula clicking against the plastic tray, when the bell above the door chimed. I didn't look up immediately. "Be right with you," I said, my fingers sliding the pills into the amber vial. "Take your time, Mom." Mitchell stood at the end of the counter, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his canvas jacket. His hair was damp from the morning drizzle, and there was a dark smear of grease across his cheekbone. He looked smaller under the harsh white lights of the store than he did in the shadowed corners of my dining room. "Mitchell," I said, setting the spatula down, "you're off today?" "Lumberyard's waiting on a shipment of cedar. Rain delayed the trucks." He looked around the empty store, his eyes lingering on the security mirror in the corner before coming back to me. "I need some of that heavy-duty joint cream for my wrists." I reached under the counter and pulled out the blue tub he always used. "You're working too hard. You've got your father's joints. He couldn't hold a hammer by the time he was 40.
My father died when I was 7, Mom.
I don't remember what his joints looked like.
The bluntness of it didn't hurt anymore. It was just the way Mitchell was. He had a way of cutting through my small attempts at sentimentality like a dry wind. As I rang up the cream, I watched his hands. His knuckles were raw, the skin split near the nails. "You didn't go home last night," I said, keeping my voice level, the same tone I used when asking a customer if they wanted a receipt. He didn't flinch. He just reached into his pocket and pulled out a crumpled $10 bill, smoothing it out on the glass counter with his thumb.
My alternator was acting up. I pulled over by the bridge to check the belt.
"For 40 minutes? Mitchell's thumb stopped. He looked at the $10 bill, then up at me. His eyes were very light, almost gray in the pharmacy light.
You were watching.
I was looking out the window, I said. Calvin was out there too. A customer came in, old Mr. Henderson, his oxygen tank clicking behind him like a slow clock. Mitchell waited until the old man had shuffled past the greeting cards toward the back before he spoke again. His voice was lower now, barely a murmur over the hum of the lights.
You shouldn't be looking out the window at night, Mom. It's bad for your eyes.
Mitchell, what is going on between you two? I leaned forward, my hands resting on the cool edge of the counter. For 12 years, I've had to watch what I say because I thought the two of you would tear this house apart. I thought you hated him. I thought he couldn't stand the sight of you.
We don't hate each other,
Mitchell said. He picked up the blue tub of cream, but he didn't put it in his pocket. He just held it, turning it over and over.
We have an understanding.
What kind of understanding? The kind that keeps this family from going under, he said. He leaned closer, and I could smell the damp canvas of his jacket, the smell of wood shavings and cold river air. Calvin's got 3 years left on the mortgage. His hip is shot. The pension from the county doesn't cover his physical therapy, let alone the taxes. I pay the taxes, I said, my voice rising slightly. I've paid them out of my checks for 5 years. Mitchell let out a short, dry sound that might have been a laugh if his mouth hadn't stayed so straight. You pay what he tells you the taxes are, Mom. The bell above the door chimed again. A young mother with a coughing toddler walked in, her keys jingling in her hand. Mitchell took a step back from the counter, his posture instantly straightening, the shutters coming down behind his eyes. I have to get back to the yard, he said. Mitchell, wait! I reached out, my fingers brushing the rough canvas of his sleeve. What did he mean last night? About the shed? What's in there? He looked down at my hand on his arm. For a second, just a split second, he looked like the boy who used to hide behind my knees when the neighbor's dogs barked too loud. Then he pulled away, gently but firmly. Don't go near the back of the property, Mom, he said, his voice dropping so low I had to read his lips. And if Calvin asks you for the spare key to the cellar, tell him you lost it. Before I could speak, he turned and walked out, the bell jingling merrily behind him as he stepped into the gray drizzle of the street. I stood behind the counter, my hand still hovering in the empty air where his sleeve had been. We think we protect our children by keeping the truth from them, but we forget that they are watching us from the shadows, learning our weaknesses before they even know the words for them. I had spent 12 years believing I was the shield between my son and my husband, but as I looked down at the $10 bill Mitchell had left on the glass, I realized the shield had been made of paper, and both of them had been looking through it the entire time. The rain had stopped by the time my shift ended at 5, but the sky remained the color of wet slate. When I let myself into the house through the kitchen door, the air inside was thick with the smell of fried bacon fat and damp wool. Calvin was sitting at the kitchen table, his heavy work gloves on, using a small pocket knife to scrape the mud from the soles of his work boots onto a sheet of old newspaper. You're late, he said, not looking up. The knife made a dry, rhythmic shuck-shuck sound against the leather. There was a backup at the crossing, I lied. I set my purse on the counter, my fingers lingering on the strap. The coal train was idling on the tracks. The coal train doesn't run on Thursdays, Calvin said. The knife stopped. He looked up, his pale eyes catching the low light from the stove hood. He didn't look angry. He looked patient, the way a schoolteacher looks at a child who has forgotten their spelling words. They must have changed the schedule, I said, my voice steady, though my stomach did a slow, cold turn. A year ago, I would have apologized. I would have offered to make him fresh coffee or started peeling potatoes to make up for the 5 minutes of his life I had supposedly wasted. But today, The weight of the lie didn't feel heavy. It felt like a small, hard stone I was keeping in my pocket. Calvin stood up, folding the pocket knife with a soft click. He stepped off the newspaper, leaving a small pile of gray clay on the kitchen floor. "I was looking for the brass ring," he said. "The one with the cellar key on it, the old iron one." My hand, still resting on my purse, tightened. Mitchell's voice from the pharmacy counter echoed in my ears. "If Calvin asks you for the spare key to the cellar, tell him you lost it." "The cellar key?" I asked, looking toward the hook by the pantry where it had hung for a decade. The hook was empty, the paint around it slightly paler where the brass ring used to rest. "I haven't seen it since the plumber came in October. He must have left it down there." "The plumber didn't go through the cellar hatch," Calvin said. His voice was very quiet, very flat. He took a step toward me, his heavy frame blocking the light from the hallway. "He went through the crawl space under the sink. You know that, Lorraine. You held the flashlight." "My memory isn't what it used to be, Cal," I said, looking him straight in the eyes. It was the first time in 30 years of marriage that I had looked at him and felt absolutely nothing. No fear, no affection, no irritation. He was just a large, graying man standing in my kitchen, smelling of grease and damp earth. He stared at me for 3 long seconds. In the silence, I could hear the kitchen clock ticking, each beat sounding like a fingernail tapping on glass. "I'm going to get the crowbar from the truck," he said finally. "The sump pump is backing up. If I don't get down there tonight, the floorboards in the dining room are going to warp." He didn't wait for me to answer. He walked past me, his shoulder brushing mine just hard enough to make me step back against the counter. The screen door banged shut behind him, and then came the slow, heavy crunch of his boots on the gravel. I had maybe 4 minutes. I didn't go to the pantry hook. I went straight to the old pine hutch in the corner of the dining room, the one that held my mother's good china that we never used. Behind the gravy boat, in a small blue tin box where I kept spare buttons and expired coupons, was the duplicate. It was an old skeleton key, heavy and rusted, that my father-in-law had given me when we first bought the house. "Just in case Cal ever locks himself out," the old man had said with a dry wink. "He's got a habit of closing doors behind him." My fingers were cold as I fished the key out from under a pile of white shirt buttons. The cellar of our house was built in the late 19th century, a damp cavern of fieldstone and cedar posts that could only be accessed from 2 places: the wooden storm doors in the backyard or a narrow, steep set of stairs behind the pantry. Calvin had nailed the pantry door shut 12 years ago, the same month Mitchell turned 15. He told me the draft from the stone floor was driving our heating bill up. I had watched him drive 3 heavy steel nails through the casing, sealing the darkness away behind 3 inches of pine. I stepped into the pantry. The smell of dried thyme and vinegar was strong here. I reached behind the heavy wire shelves where I kept the canned peaches and the glass jars of pickled beets. My fingers found the edge of the wooden door. The nails were gone. They hadn't been pulled recently. The holes in the wood were gray and dusty, but when I pressed my palm against the panels, the door gave a small, greasy creak. Someone had pulled the nails years ago and replaced them with small black wood screws that had been painted over to look like old nail heads. They were loose, turned just enough that the door could be swung open if you knew where to pull. I inserted the rusted skeleton key into the keyhole. It turned with a dry, grinding groan that sounded, to my ears, like a scream. I pushed the door open. A wave of cold, dead air hit me. It didn't smell like a wet cellar. It didn't smell like rotting potatoes or moldy joists. It smelled of paraffin, kerosene, and the sharp chemical tang of industrial solder. I pulled my phone from my pocket and turned on the flashlight. The narrow wooden steps were gray with dust, but there were clear, overlapping tracks in the center. The heavy, broad prints of Calvin's work boots, and beside them, the narrower, lighter prints of Mitchell's work shoes. They had been down here together, recently. I took 3 steps down, the wood creaking under my weight. The beam of my light cut through the dark, reflecting off something shiny at the far end of the cellar, near the old coal bin. It wasn't coal. Stacked neatly against the fieldstone wall were 6 large black plastic crates, the kind they use for shipping commercial tools. On top of the crates sat a small, leather-bound ledger with a pencil tucked into the brass spiral. I reached out, my hand shaking slightly, and picked up the ledger. The cover was stained with grease. I opened it. The first page was in Mitchell's neat, small handwriting, the hand he'd learned from the nuns at St. Jude's. October 14th, 4 boxes, delivered to Terminal 3. C paid $1,200. Below it, in Calvin's heavy, jagged script, October 15th, Lorraine's pharmacy check, $840. Balance remaining on mortgage, $14,200. Mitchell's cut, $400. A floorboard creaked directly above my head. I froze on the 3rd step of the cellar stairs, my hand pressed against the damp fieldstone wall to steady myself. Directly above me, the heavy, uneven step of my husband moved from the stove to the pantry door. I turned off my phone's flashlight, plunging myself into an absolute, suffocating blackness. The air down here smelled of 80 years of trapped winter, and now that sharp, metallic tang of industrial solder. I heard his boots stop on the other side of the pantry wall. The thin pine door was the only thing separating us. If he pulled the wire shelves aside, if he noticed the wood screws were loose. A metal-on-metal clang echoed through the floorboards. Calvin had set the crowbar down on the kitchen counter. "Lorraine?" his voice called out. It sounded muffled, like he was speaking through a wool blanket, but the vibration traveled down the wooden joists and into the soles of my feet. "Lorraine, did you find those rags?" I didn't breathe. My lungs felt flat, dry. I waited for the sound of his hand on the pantry door latch. "Lorraine?" "I'm in the hallway, Cal," I called back, my voice pitched slightly higher than normal to mimic distance. I had to force the air out of my throat, my legs already moving silently up the stairs in the dark. I slipped through the loose door, pressed it shut until the latch clicked, and slid the 3 jars of preserved peaches back into their dusty rings on the shelf. When I stepped out of the pantry into the kitchen light, my face was hot. My fingers were gray with coal dust and lime from the cellar wall. Calvin was standing by the sink, his hands empty, looking at the spot where I had just appeared. His eyes didn't go to my face first. They dropped to my hands, then to the hem of my cardigan, which was covered in fine white cellar dust. "You've got plaster on your sleeve," he said. "I was looking in the back of the utility closet for those old towels," I said, wiping my palms on my apron. My heart was knocking against my ribs like a trapped bird, but I kept my chin up, looking at the grease stain on his shirt collar. "The drywall is crumbling back there. We need to get some joint compound." Calvin didn't look at the closet. He walked over to the pantry shelf, his large frame blocking the light. He reached out and touched one of the peach jars I'd just moved. He didn't pick it up. He just slid his finger through the circle of clean wood in the dust where the jar had sat 3 minutes ago. "The jars are sticky," he said. "They're old," I replied. "They've been there since my mother died." "We should throw them out," he said, his back still to me. "No sense keeping things that have gone sour." He didn't mention the cellar key again. He picked up his crowbar, walked out the back door, and let the screen slam. A moment later, I heard the heavy, screeching groan of the iron storm doors being pried open from the outside. He was going down into the cellar the long way, through the yard. I stood in the center of the kitchen, my hands still tucked into my apron pockets. My right index finger was curled around the heavy, cold loop of the duplicate skeleton key. At midnight, the house was silent, save for the dry, rhythmic rattle of the wind through the loose storm windows. Calvin was asleep, his heavy, rattling snores rising from the master bedroom down the hall. I sat in the guest room, the small brass lamp on the nightstand turned down so low the room was mostly amber shadows. On my lap was a green plastic accordion file I had pulled from the bottom of the closet. This was my archive, 30 years of electric bills, property tax receipts, and the small, blue-lined notebooks where I kept track of our grocery spending. I turned the pages slowly, the dry paper whispering in the quiet. I had always known we weren't rich. The county road commission didn't pay much, and my pharmacy wage mostly went to insurance and food. But we had always stayed above water, or so I had believed. I found the mortgage statement from 4 years ago. The monthly payment was $620. Then I found the statement from 6 months ago. The monthly payment had jumped to $1,450. There was a letter attached to the back, printed on cheap yellow paper from a bank in the next county. Notice of default and intent to foreclose. The bank had given Calvin 30 days to clear a second home equity loan of $12,000, a loan I had never signed, on a house that had been left to me by my own father. My signature was on the bottom of the document. The handwriting was neat, the letters small and round. It looked like my signature. It looked like the name I wrote 20 times a day on the pharmacy logs. But the L in Lorraine didn't have the small, sharp hook at the top that my father had taught me to write when I was 6. It was smooth. It was Mitchell's handwriting. My son had forged my name to save his stepfather from losing the house. Or perhaps his stepfather had made him do it. I leaned back against the headboard, the paper rattling in my hand. A family is not a single structure. It is a series of quiet, invisible debts. We spend our lives believing we are loved for who we are, when in reality, we are loved for what we can carry without complaining. Mitchell had carried this. Calvin had carried this. They had locked the debt in the cellar, under my feet, while I made their dinners and washed their sheets, entirely blind to the weight of the roof over my head. Down the hall, the snoring stopped. I held my breath, my fingers instantly closing the green file folder. I listened to the silence of the house, waiting for the sound of Calvin's heavy, dragging limp on the floorboards. Instead, I heard the faint, metallic clink of the telephone base in the hallway. Someone was dialing. In our house, the old rotary phone in the hall had a loud, mechanical bell, but if you lifted the receiver in the master bedroom, it made only a small, wet click. I slipped out of the bed, my bare feet silent on the cold wood, and pressed my ear to the door crack. Calvin's voice was a low, gravelly rasp in the dark. "She was in the pantry," he said. A long pause. I could hear the faint, high-pitched buzz of a voice on the other end of the line. Mitchell's voice. "She didn't get down there," Calvin continued. His voice was flat, devoid of the irritation he usually had when speaking to Mitchell. "But she's looking. She's got the key from the old man's tin. I saw the dust on her cardigan." Another pause. The wind threw a handful of dry leaves against the window pane. "We can't move the crates tonight," Calvin said. "The deputy's truck was parked by the quarry till 10. If she goes down there while we're gone, the whole thing goes sideways." He cleared his throat, a wet, rattling sound. "Get the truck ready for tomorrow night," Calvin said. "And Mitchell, don't call the house again. She's starting to listen to the rings." The line went dead with a sharp, heavy click. The coffee Calvin poured for me on Friday morning was too strong. He had used the heavy chicory blend he usually reserved for his fishing trips, and he'd left the tin on the counter, its lid slightly askew. "You're quiet today, Lorraine," he said. He was sitting in his usual spot, his blue-veined hands wrapped around his mug. He had shaved, but his collar was open, showing the pale, crepey skin of his neck. "I didn't sleep well," I said, stirring a spoonful of sugar into the dark mud of my cup. The wind was rattling the storm sash. "I'll tighten the turn buttons before I go out tonight," he said. His voice was casual, almost warm. It was the tone he used when he wanted me to believe he was being a good husband, the kind of husband who noticed drafty windows and took care of them without being asked. "I have to help Warren down at the township garage. His tractor's got a split manifold." "That'll take some time," I said. "Probably won't be back till after midnight," he replied. He took a slow sip of his coffee, his eyes tracking the steam as it rose. "Don't wait up." I looked at him over the rim of my mug. The man I had lived with for 12 years was a stranger, but he was a stranger whose habits I knew better than my own. I knew the exact hitch in his breath before he lied. I knew the way his left shoulder slumped when he was carrying something heavy. "I won't," I said. I left the house at 7. But instead of driving straight to the pharmacy, I pulled my old sedan into the gravel lot of the Methodist church 3 miles down the road. I sat in the car with the engine off, the heater slowly dying, and watched the fog rise off the pasture land. The hardest part of being the anchor for a family is realizing they only value you for how deep you can sink into the mud to keep them still. They didn't want my advice. They didn't want my love. Not really. They wanted my silence. They wanted me to be the clean, quiet kitchen they came back to after they had spent the night doing things that made their hands dirty. At noon, I took my lunch break. I told the pharmacist, a young man named Greg who spent his shifts listening to baseball games on a small radio, that I had to go to the bank. Instead, I drove back to the house. I parked the car half a mile down the lane, behind an old equipment shed that belonged to a cousin who had died 5 years ago. I walked through the woods, the wet pine needles slipping under my sensible white pharmacy shoes, until I reached our back fence. Calvin's truck was gone. The house stood in the gray light, its white paint peeling around the foundations. It looked smaller from the back, like an old box someone had dropped in the weeds and forgotten. I let myself in through the kitchen door. The house was cold. Calvin always turned the thermostat down to 55 when he left to save on heating oil. I didn't hesitate. I went straight to the pantry, slid the peach jars aside, and opened the thin pine door. The duplicate key was cold in my hand as I inserted it into the heavy iron lock. It turned with a wet, greasy slide. I stepped down into the dark cellar, the beam of my phone's light cutting through the gray mist. I walked past the old coal bin to the 6 black plastic shipping crates. My heart was thumping against my ribs, but my hands were steady as I reached for the plastic latches of the top trunk. They flipped open with 2 sharp, hollow snaps. I lifted the lid. The smell of kerosene and industrial solder was almost overpowering. Inside, resting on a bed of heavy gray wool blankets, were 3 commercial-grade copper coils, the kind used for industrial refrigeration. Beside them lay 6 brass pressure gauges, each one stamped with the blue and white logo of the State Railway Commission. Stolen state utility scrap. Mitchell's lumber yard sat right next to the rail spur at the terminal. He had the keys to the yard gates. Calvin had the truck and the county road maps that showed which lines were inactive and which ones still had live copper. But it was what lay beneath the blankets that made my knees go weak. I reached down, my fingers brushing the cold, greasy steel of a small rectangular metal box. I pulled it out. It was a lockbox from the county clerk's office, the one where Calvin had worked 20 years ago before his hip went bad. The lock had been forced, the brass-plated latch bent back with a screwdriver. Inside the box were 3 thick packets of blue paper. They were land deeds. I opened the first one. It was the deed to our house, the one my father had signed over to me on his deathbed. Across the top, in red ink, was a stamp from the county assessor. Liabilities transferred to Mitchell Vance, co-signer. And pinned to the back of the deed was a single folded sheet of white paper with the letterhead of the pharmacy where I worked. It was a copy of the weekly narcotics log, the registry of fentanyl patches and liquid morphine we kept in the safe behind the counter. The columns were filled out in my neat, round hand, but several of the quantities had been altered with a fine black pen. A 2 had been turned into an 8, a 1 had been turned into a 7, and at the bottom of the page, in Mitchell's small, tight hand, was a list of dates. November 3rd, delivered to Bridge. November 17th, delivered to Bridge. December 1st, delivered to Bridge. My son wasn't just stealing scrap. He was using my signature, my house, and my job to clear his stepfather's debts. A heavy metallic thud echoed from the yard above my head. The wooden storm doors, the ones Calvin had pried open last night, creaked. A shaft of gray daylight cut through the dark of the cellar, reflecting off the stone floor 60 feet away. I stood frozen in the beam of my own phone light, the blue deeds clutched to my chest as the sound of boots began to descend the stone steps. "Mom!" The voice was Mitchell's, but it was thin, stripped of the flat arrogance he usually wore like armor. I didn't turn the phone's light toward him. I kept it pointed at the blue land deeds clutched in my hand. In the reflected glow, I could see his boots on the bottom stone step. He was wearing his heavy lumberyard coat, but he'd forgotten his gloves. His bare fingers were red from the cold, and they were shaking. "Put those back," he whispered. He didn't come any closer. He stood by the base of the stairs, his head tilted slightly as if he were listening for the sound of Calvin's truck in the driveway. "Please, Mom, just put them back in the box." "You signed my name, Mitchell," I said. My voice didn't sound like mine. It was dry, hollowed out, like an old well that had gone dust dry years ago. "On the second mortgage, on the default notices." Mitchell took a slow, heavy breath. He looked down at his boots. "He was going to sell the place, Mom. He had a developer from the county line offering $40,000 for the acreage. He said if I didn't co-sign the equity loan to pay off his old credit cards, he'd sign the papers and we'd have 30 days to get out." "It's my house," I said. "My father left it to me." "Your father left it to you, but Calvin's name has been on the tax registry since '98, Mitchell said, his voice rising slightly, a small, desperate edge cutting through the dark. "He knew the law, Mom. He knew that if he claimed the house was uninhabitable because of the roof, he could force a partition sale. I had to do it. I had to buy us time." "And the pharmacy?" I held up the white sheets of the narcotics log. The paper rattled in my hand. "Did you sign my name to these too? Did you alter these logs?" Mitchell didn't answer. He reached out and grabbed the damp cedar post beside him, his knuckles turning white. He looked older than 27. In the dim gray light from the storm doors, he looked like a man who had been carrying a rotted beam on his shoulders for so long he'd forgotten how to stand up straight. "That wasn't me," he said. "Then who?" "Calvin," Mitchell whispered. He's had your spare key ring since the hot water heater went out. He kept the one to the back door of the store. He goes in on Sunday nights while you're at church. He only takes the liquid morphine, the stuff that's easy to dilute with sterile water so the inventory weights stay the same. My stomach turned. I remembered the 3 Sundays in October when Calvin had complained of his hip being too stiff for him to sit in the pew. He'd stayed home, he said, to put heat on it. I had sat in the chapel alone, listening to the choir, while my husband was using my keys to systematically ruin my life. Why? I asked. What does he need that kind of money for? He's leaving, Mom, Mitchell said. He finally took 3 steps toward me, his boots clicking on the damp stone floor. He's got a sister in Tucson. He's already bought a trailer down there under his first wife's name. He's moving the last of the copper coils tonight, and then he's going to empty the pharmacy's safe on Sunday. He's going to make it look like an inside job. He's going to leave you with the default, the missing drugs, and the cops. A mother's forgiveness is a currency her children spend until they are completely bankrupt, and only then do they realize she was the one paying their debts. I looked at Mitchell, my only child, the boy I had protected from his father's temper and then from Calvin's coldness. He had known about this for months. He had known his stepfather was going to destroy me, and he had spent his nights moving stolen metal to keep himself from being dragged down with him. You knew, I said. I was trying to get enough cash to pay off the bank before he went, Mitchell pleaded. He reached out, his red fingers hovering near my sleeve, but not quite touching it. If I could get the mortgage current, the bank wouldn't sell. I could get his name off the deed. I was trying to save the house for you, Mom. That's the only reason I did the copper, I swear to God. You saved the wood, Mitchell, I said, looking down at the blue papers. But you let the house burn down anyway. Above us, the kitchen window rattled. It wasn't the wind this time. It was the low, heavy vibration of Calvin's truck turning off the county road into our driveway. The headlights swept across the high basement window, casting long, barred shadows across the stone floor of the cellar. Mitchell's face went pale. He looked at the stairs, then back at me, his eyes wide with a sudden animal panic. He's back, Mitchell whispered. He wasn't supposed to be back till 5. He must have seen my truck behind the equipment shed. Go up the pantry stairs, I said, my voice cold and flat as a slate shingle. Mom, if he sees the door is open. Go, I repeated. I shoved the blue deeds and the pharmacy logs back into the black plastic trunk and snapped the latches shut. Lock the door from the pantry side. Use the skeleton key. If he asks, tell him you came to borrow some tools. Mitchell didn't argue. He turned and scrambled up the narrow wooden steps, his boots making a soft, frantic scuffing sound against the pine. A second later, I heard the pantry door click shut, followed by the dry, grinding sound of the skeleton key turning in the lock. I stood in the absolute dark of the cellar, my back pressed against the fieldstone wall. Outside, the truck engine died. The metal door of the cab slammed shut, the sound sharp and clean in the cold afternoon air. Then came the slow, heavy crunch of Calvin's boots on the gravel, moving toward the iron storm doors. He was coming down, and I was still inside. The iron storm doors creaked open, the sound scraping against the quiet of the yard like a shovel on concrete. The gray afternoon light flooded down the stone steps, cutting the darkness of the cellar into sharp, dusty diagonals. I stood by the coal bin, my phone tucked into my apron pocket, my hands hanging loose at my sides. I didn't hide. When you've spent 30 years keeping a house clean, you lose the instinct to hide in it. You realize there is no corner of a home that doesn't eventually have to be dusted. Calvin's boots came down first. He moved slowly, his bad hip forcing him to take the stone steps one at a time, his heavy body swaying with each descent. When he reached the gravel floor, he stopped. He was wearing his heavy canvas coat, the collar turned up against the drizzle, and he carried a red-handled crowbar in his right hand. He didn't look at the black crates. He looked straight at me. "You're down here," he said. It wasn't a question. "I came down to look for the kerosene heater," I said. My voice was calm, the same tone I used when a customer complained about the price of their heart medication. "It's getting cold upstairs. The wind is coming through the pantry floor." Calvin took a slow, heavy step forward. His boots made a wet, grinding sound on the loose gravel. He stopped 3 feet from me, the smell of damp wool and cold grease coming off his coat in waves. He reached out with his left hand, his thick, calloused thumb gently brushing a gray smudge of coal dust from my cheek. "The heater's in the garage, Lorraine," he said. His voice was very soft, almost tender, the way he used to speak to me when we were first married, and he wanted me to believe he was a gentle man. "You helped me carry it out in March, don't you remember?" "My memory is like the weather, Cal," I said, looking him in the eyes. "It changes." His thumb lingered on my skin for a second too long, his fingernail rough against my cheekbone, before he let his hand drop. His eyes flickered past my shoulder toward the narrow wooden stairs that led to the pantry. He walked past me, his shoulder heavy against mine, and tried the door latch. It didn't budge. Mitchell had locked it from the other side. Calvin let out a dry, rattling sound from his chest, a small, silent laugh that didn't reach his eyes. "Locked," he said, tapping the flat of his crowbar against the pine panel. "We must have a draft coming through here, the wood's swollen." "It's an old house, Cal," I said. "Things warp." "They do," he agreed. He turned back to face me, his frame blocking the light from the storm doors. "Let's go upstairs. It's too damp down here for a woman your age. Your knees will be stiff by morning." In the kitchen, Mitchell was sitting at the table. He had let himself out of the pantry and was sitting with a mug of cold water in front of him, his fingers tracing the blue willow pattern on the oilcloth. He looked up when we came through the doorway, his eyes darting from my face to Calvin's crowbar, then back down to his water. "Mitch is staying for supper," Calvin said, setting the crowbar down on the counter with a sharp, heavy clack. "His truck's still having trouble. I told him he shouldn't be driving that river road in the fog." "I'll peel some potatoes," I said. I went to the sink and pulled the heavy wire basket of russets from under the cupboard. My hands were steady as I took the paring knife from the drawer. I stood with my back to them, watching their reflections in the dark glass of the kitchen window. Calvin sat down opposite Mitchell, his heavy legs sprawling under the table. "We have to go down to the township garage tonight, Mitch," he said, his voice casual. "Warren said we can use his hoist to look at your alternator. We'll leave around 8. "Okay," Mitchell said. He didn't look at his stepfather. His voice was small, choked. "And Lorraine," Calvin said. I stopped peeling, the brown skin of the potato curling over my thumb. "Yes, Cal?" "You've got that Sunday inventory at the store, right?" he asked. "The one where you have to count the liquids in the back safe?" "Yes," I said. "The state inspector is coming on Wednesday." "You want to make sure everything's in order," Calvin said. He leaned back in his chair, the wood creaking under his weight. "We wouldn't want any discrepancies in those logs. A pharmacy license is a hard thing to get back once the county gets involved, especially at your age." It was a perfect, quiet circle. He had the deeds, he had the forged signatures, and he had the altered logs. If I spoke to the sheriff, Calvin would simply walk away, and Mitchell and I would be left in the ruins of the house, holding the empty bottles. A man who spends 12 years building a trap for his wife eventually forgets that he has to live in the house with her. He assumes that because she has kept the kitchen clean, she doesn't know how to clean the house of him. "I'll make sure everything is in order, Cal," I said, my voice dropping into a quiet, rhythmic cadence as I slid the knife through the white flesh of the potato. "Good," Calvin said. "I like it when things are orderly." I looked at the paring knife in my hand. The blade was thin, worn down to a gray crescent from 30 years of sharpening. It wasn't a weapon. But as I watched the two of them in the window reflection, the man who had stolen my life and the son who had let him do it, I realized I didn't need a weapon. I just needed to stop holding the walls up. "Mitchell," I said, not turning around, "go out to the garden bag in the shed. Bring me the small blue tin from the shelf, the one with the garden tags." Mitchell's reflection in the glass froze. He knew what was in that tin. He knew the duplicate skeleton key was already in my pocket, but he also knew that if he went to the shed, he would have to look at what they had buried down there. "Now, Mitchell," I said, "before it gets too dark to see." Mitchell stood up. His chair made a sharp screeching sound against the linoleum that made my teeth ache. He didn't look at Calvin, and he didn't look at me. He just walked to the back door, his boots heavy, and stepped out into the dark drizzle. The kitchen door clicked shut. The silence that followed was different from the others. It was thin, stretched tight like a wire under too much tension. I went back to the potatoes, the water in the pot beginning to simmer, sending small, wet plumes of steam up against the cold window pane. "Arizona is dry, Cal," I said to the glass. "It'll be good for your hip." Behind me, the creak of Calvin's chair stopped. I could feel the weight of his stare on my back, heavy and cold as a wet wool blanket. "What are you talking about?" he asked. His voice had lost its soft, polite edge. It was dry now, flat as the prairie. "The brochure," I said, sliding another potato into the pot. The water splashed, a few hot drops landing on my wrist. I didn't wipe them off. "The one from the mobile home park in Tucson. You left it in the pocket of your brown trousers, the ones I washed on Tuesday." I turned around to face him. I leaned against the sink, the paring knife still in my hand, its tip pointing toward the floorboards. "You've been planning this since the spring, haven't you?" I asked. "Before the roof started leaking, before you took the second mortgage." Calvin didn't flinch. He sat with his hands flat on the oilcloth, his thick fingers spread wide. "A man my age has to look out for his future, Lorraine. You can't expect me to sit in this damp valley until the timber rots out from under me." "I expected you to tell me," I said. "And what would you have done?" he asked, his lips curving into that small, dry smile again. "Cried? Begged me to stay? You haven't looked at me in 5 years, Lorraine. You don't want a husband. You want an old dog you can feed twice a day and ignore the rest of the time." The cruelty of it didn't pierce me. When you've been emotionally ignored for 12 years, a man's cruelty is almost a relief. It's proof that he still knows you're in the room. "You're right," I said quietly. "I stopped looking at you. But I didn't stop looking after you. I paid the oil bills, Calvin. I bought your heart medicine. I kept the bank from taking the land while you were sitting in the tavern telling Warren how hard your life was. And look where it got you," he said. He stood up, his great frame rising from the chair, his bad hip making him tilt slightly to the left. He walked over to the stove, his face shadowed in the yellow light of the hood. "You think you've got me cornered because you found some papers in a tin box? You're 70 miles from the nearest city, Lorraine. If I leave tonight, who's going to pay the December taxes? Who's going to keep the bank from padlocking that door?" He leaned closer, his breath smelling of the chicory coffee and grease. "If I go down, Mitchell goes with me," he whispered. "You think the sheriff's going to care that he's your boy? He signed those default papers. He moved the wire. If I tell the county prosecutor what we've been doing, Mitchell's going to spend his 31st birthday in the state farm." "I know," I said. Calvin's eyes narrowed. He looked at my face, searching for the crack, the tear, the small, desperate sob he'd been waiting for since he first moved his dresser into my room. But there was nothing. My face was as flat and gray as the river fog. "You're bluffing," he said. "I called the bank in the next county this morning, Cal," I said. My voice was very quiet, very steady. During my 15-minute break, I spoke to the manager, Mr. Albright. I told him my signature on the equity loan was a forgery. The screen door banged open. Mitchell stood in the doorway, his coat wet with rain. He was holding the small blue tin by its wire handle, his fingers red and raw. He stopped when he saw the two of us standing by the stove, the air between us thick enough to choke on. "Here," Mitchell said, his voice cracking. He walked over and set the tin on the table with a soft, hollow clink. Calvin didn't look at the tin. He kept his eyes on me, his chest rising and falling with a slow, heavy rhythm. "You didn't call Albright," he said. "He's sending a fraud investigator on Monday morning, Cal," I said. "He told me to stay in the house and not to touch any of the financial files. He said the state police would be handling the signature verification." Mitchell's hand, still resting on the blue tin, began to shake. He looked at me, his eyes wide, his mouth opening but no sound coming out. "Mom?" he whispered. What did you do?" "I told the truth, Mitchell," I said. "You put me in jail," he said, his voice dropping into a ragged, desperate sob. "Mom, they'll arrest me. I signed those papers." "I know," I said again. A man who spends his life using his family as a shield eventually forgets that the shield has its own weight. I had spent 12 years being the buffer between my son's mistakes and my husband's greed. But as I looked at Mitchell, wet and shivering by the table, I realized the only way to save him from Calvin was to let the fire reach him. "The investigator will be here at 9 on Monday," I said. "You have 60 hours, Calvin, to move the crates, to get your sister's trailer ready, to do whatever it is you do in the dark." The kitchen clock ticked, once, twice, 3 times. Outside, in the gravel driveway, the sound of a car engine rose through the fog. It wasn't the low, wet rumble of Mitchell's diesel, and it wasn't the heavy rattle of Calvin's truck. It was a light, 4-cylinder engine, idling quietly near our front porch. The headlights flickered through the willow pattern wallpaper, casting 2 long, white rectangles across the kitchen floor. No one moved. The knock on the screen door was 3 short, metallic raps. Calvin didn't look at me. He didn't look at Mitchell. He walked to the door, his bad hip making a dull thump drag against the linoleum. When he pushed the wooden inner door open, the yellow light from the kitchen porch fell on a man standing in the drizzle. It was Roy Miller. Roy owned the auto body shop down by the county road crossing, a small, rusted tin building where old tractors went to die. He was 50, with a face like dry leather and grease permanently ground into the creases of his knuckles. He was wearing a damp oilskin jacket, his ball cap turned backwards so the rain dripped off the bill onto his neck. "Mitch's truck was behind the equipment shed," Roy said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that smelled of wintergreen tobacco. "He didn't come in. He stood on the porch, his eyes darting past Calvin's shoulder into the kitchen, taking in Mitchell's white face and the pot of boiling potatoes on the stove. I thought you guys were ducking me. The boy from the valley has been waiting at the crossing since 7. We're not ducking you, Roy, Calvin said. His voice was smooth again, the flat, neighborly tone he used at township meetings. Mitch had some belt trouble. We were just finishing up supper. We don't have time for supper, Roy said, his eyes finally landing on me. He took off his cap, exposing a gray, receding hairline, and gave me a polite, nervous nod. Evening, Lorraine. Sorry to disturb the house. Evening, Roy, I said, not moving from the sink. I still had the paring knife in my right hand, the gray potato starch drying on the blade. The terminal guy is leaving at 9, Roy continued, turning back to Calvin. His voice was dropping, trying to keep itself under the hum of the stove fan, but in our kitchen, every whisper had an echo. He's only got the one truck. If we don't get those 6 crates loaded before the rain gets heavier, he's going to drive the empty flatbed back to the city. Mitchell stood up. He looked at Calvin, his eyes wide and dark with a sudden, ugly realization. The crates? Mitchell asked, his voice shaking. Roy, what do you mean the crates? Calvin said we were only moving the small coils tonight. He said we were saving the rest for Sunday. Roy looked from Mitchell to Calvin, his brow furrowing. He was a practical man, a mechanic who understood gears and grease, but he didn't understand the quiet, shifting sands of our kitchen. Sunday? Roy asked, letting out a short, wet spit into the damp flower bed beside the porch. Calvin, what's he talking about? You told me the buyer from Tucson was taking the whole lot tonight. The copper, the brass fittings, and the 3 blue boxes from the safe. The 3 blue boxes. That was the liquid morphine. The bottles Calvin had stolen from my pharmacy safe. He hadn't planned on waiting until Sunday. He hadn't planned on leaving Mitchell time to get his name off the mortgage. He was moving everything tonight, the stolen scrap, the narcotics, and the cash. And by Saturday morning, he would be on the interstate to Arizona, while Mitchell and I were still sleeping in the house he'd already sold. When a man builds a lie, he doesn't just build it for his enemies, he builds it for his partners, because a lie is only safe when everyone has a different piece of the map. Calvin had given Roy one piece, Mitchell another, and me the blank back of the page. Mitchell took 2 steps toward his stepfather, his chest heaving under his wet coat. You were going to leave me, Mitchell whispered. You were going to let me take the fall for the bank. You were going to let them arrest me for the signatures. Calvin didn't look at him. He kept his eyes on Roy. Wait in the truck, Roy, he said quietly. Calvin, what's going on here? Roy asked, his hand lingering on the screen door frame. He looked at the paring knife in my hand, then at the blue tin on the table. He was beginning to see the shape of the trap, and he didn't want his name on the registry when the state police arrived. If this is family business, I'm out. I'm not getting my yard padlocked over some domestic dispute. Go to the truck, Roy, Calvin repeated. His voice wasn't loud, but it had the heavy, cold thud of a spade hitting frozen dirt. I'll be out in 5 minutes. Roy didn't say another word. He turned, his damp oilskin jacket rustling in the dark, and walked back down the steps. A moment later, the door of his sedan slammed shut, the light 4-cylinder engine idling in the driveway like a watch ticking down the seconds. Calvin closed the heavy inner door. He turned the brass deadbolt, the lock clicking into place with a sound that felt like the final tooth of a gear engaging. He looked at Mitchell, then at me. His face was completely gray now, the skin around his eyes tight and white. He didn't look like a husband anymore, and he didn't look like a stepfather. He looked like a man who had reached the end of a very long, very quiet road and realized the bridge was out. We're going down to the cellar, Calvin said. He picked up the red-handled crowbar from the counter. All of us, he said. The pantry door creaked as Mitchell turned the skeleton key, the old iron mechanism grinding in the casing. We went down the stairs first, me, then Mitchell, with Calvin's heavy, dragging step bringing up the rear. The air in the cellar had grown colder since the afternoon, the damp from the pasture land creeping through the fieldstone walls until the mortar felt like wet salt. My phone's light was the only thing cutting the dark, its white beam catching the gray plumes of our breath as we reached the gravel floor. "Get the first one, Mitchell," Calvin said. He was leaning against the heavy cedar support post, the red-handled crowbar resting against his thigh. He looked exhausted, the skin under his eyes sagged and dark, but his hand on the crowbar was steady. Mitchell looked at the black plastic crates, then at me. His face was slick with sweat despite the cold. "Mom," he whispered, "I can't. If the terminal guy takes these—" "Do what he says, Mitchell," I said. My voice was very quiet, very flat. I walked over to the old coal bin and sat down on the edge of the weathered gray timber. I folded my hands in my lap, my fingers cold against my apron. Mitchell hesitated, then reached down and grabbed the handles of the top crate. It was heavy, the copper coils inside clinking against the steel pressure gauges with a dull, wet sound. He hoisted it to his chest, his knees buckling slightly, and began the slow, painful climb up the stone steps toward the open storm doors. Calvin watched him go, the beam of his own flashlight tracking Mitchell's boots until they disappeared into the gray rain outside. "You think I'm a monster, Lorraine," Calvin said to the dark. He didn't look at me. He looked at the floorboards above our heads, where the kitchen clock was still ticking. "I don't think you're a monster, Cal," I said. "I think you're just a man who got tired of waiting for someone to thank him." He let out a short, dry breath that might have been a laugh. 12 years, he said, his voice dropping into a low, gravelly rasp. 12 years I spent clearing the brush from your father's pastures. I fixed the barn door 3 times. I paid the taxes when the pharmacy cut your hours. And every time we sat down to eat, you looked at me like I was a tenant who'd stayed past his lease. "You were a tenant, Cal," I said quietly. "You just never signed the papers." He turned his head slowly, the flashlight beam catching the edge of his jaw. "I raised your boy. I kept him out of jail when he took that neighbor's car at 16. I gave him a job at the road commission when no one else would look at him." "You didn't give him a job to help him, Cal," I said. "You gave him a job so you'd have someone to hold the other end of the wire. You've been using him to carry your weight since he was 15 years old. A second husband is often just a tenant in a house built by a dead man, paying rent in chores and silence until he decides to burn the place down just to feel the heat." Calvin had spent 12 years trying to erase my first husband's name from the walls of this house, and when he realized the wood was too deep to scrape, he decided to sell the land out from under us. "The bank account is in your name, Lorraine," Calvin said, his voice dropping so low it was almost lost in the sound of the rain outside. "The $12,000 from the equity loan. I didn't put it in my account. I opened a ledger at the county trust in your name. I used Mitchell's signature as the witness." My fingers tightened in my lap. "To the state police, it won't look like Mitchell forged your name to save me," Calvin said, his eyes catching the light. "It'll look like the two of you took the money to pay off Mitchell's lumberyard debts, and you used your position at the store to cover the interest with the morphine. You're the one with the pharmacy license, Lorraine. You're the one who signed the weekly logs." He had built the trap so perfectly, so quietly over 3 years. Every piece of paper, every signature, every modified digit in the narcotics registry was a brick in a wall he'd built around me while I was busy sweeping the floor. "Roy's truck is loaded," Mitchell's voice called out from the top of the stairs. He was standing on the gravel floor again, his chest heaving, his face white. He had carried 4 of the crates up. Only 2 remained, sitting by the coal bin like black headstones. "Get the last 2, Mitch," Calvin said, not looking at him. "Calvin, please," Mitchell said, his voice cracking. "Roy says there's a car coming down the county road. It's got no lights on. He thinks it's the deputy." Calvin's hand on the crowbar tightened. He took a step toward the stone stairs, his bad hip giving a loud, dry click in the quiet of the cellar. "Roy's a nervous old woman," he said. "Get the last crate." But Mitchell didn't move. He stood on the bottom step, his eyes fixed on the open storm doors at the top of the stairs. The gray light of the rain had gone dark, replaced by a dull yellow glow that was slowly creeping down the stone steps. It wasn't the headlights of the deputy's truck. It was too quiet, too steady. And then came the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, and light, on the wet gravel of the driveway above. The silhouette that appeared at the top of the stone stairs was small, thin, and slightly hunched against the rain. It was Greg. He was wearing his yellow plastic pharmacy slicker, the hood pulled down over his baseball cap. In his hand, he held a heavy commercial flashlight, its white beam bouncing off the wet fieldstone walls of the hatch as he descended. He looked entirely out of place in our cellar, like a paper cup floating in a grease trap. He stopped on the 3rd step from the bottom, his boots slipping slightly on the wet moss. He shined his light across the gravel floor, his eyes widening as the beam hit the black shipping crates, then Mitchell's wet coat, and finally Calvin, who was still holding the red-handled crowbar by his side. "Lorraine?" Greg's voice was high, thin, and trembling. He didn't look at Calvin or Mitchell. He kept his light fixed on my face, his chest rising and falling in quick, shallow jerks. I went to the kitchen. The door was open. I called out, but nobody answered. "What are you doing here, Greg?" I asked, my voice flat, completely devoid of the warmth I usually used when we were working the Saturday shift together. "I went to close up," Greg said. He took a half step down, his hand gripping the cold stone wall to steady himself. "After you left at noon, the state inspector called. He said he was in the next town and wanted to do the pre-audit tonight instead of Wednesday. He came to the store at 5. Greg swallowed, the sound loud in the quiet of the cellar. "We opened the safe, Lorraine," he whispered. "The liquid morphine. There were 12 boxes gone, but the log sheets, your signature was on the October entries, the ones for the Sundays when the store was closed." He stopped. He looked at the black crates sitting on the gravel. "I didn't want to call the sheriff, Lorraine," Greg said, his voice cracking with a young man's desperate, earnest confusion. "You've been there 20 years. You gave me my first reference after school. I thought maybe there was a mistake, a shipping error. I thought if I came out here you could show me where the duplicate logs were." A mother spends 30 years believing she is keeping her child safe from the world, only to realize she has to keep the world safe from him and from the man she had allowed into their home. Greg didn't want to believe I was a thief. He had driven 3 miles in the fog, risking his own license, just to give an old woman a chance to lie to him. Calvin took a slow, heavy step toward the stairs, his bad hip clicking. "He's a nice boy, Lorraine," Calvin said, his voice dropping into that soft, tender register that made my skin cold. "But he shouldn't have come out here in the dark." "Calvin," I said, "I didn't get up from the coal bin. Don't." "He's got his car parked in the lane, Cal," Mitchell said, his voice rising into a sharp, frantic panic. "If Roy sees him." Right on cue, the low, wet rumble of Roy's sedan rose through the open storm doors. But it wasn't the sound of an engine idling. It was the high, screaming whine of a transmission being shoved into reverse. Roy had seen Greg's yellow slicker go down the steps. He had seen the flashlight. He knew the state inspector was in the county, and he wasn't going to wait to find out who Greg was. The gravel in the driveway screeched as Roy's tires spun in the mud. A second later, the headlights swept across the high cellar window one last time as the sedan sped down the lane toward the county road, leaving us in the quiet of the rain. Roy was gone. The copper, the brass, and the 3 blue boxes were still sitting in the back of his truck, but the truck was currently parked a half-mile away at the equipment shed, and the buyer from Tucson was waiting at the crossing with no way to get the shipment. Calvin's face went completely still. He looked up at the open storm doors, his mouth opening slightly as the sound of Roy's engine faded into the distance. His Arizona trailer, his sister's address, his 12 years of quiet planning, all of it had just driven away in the back of a rusted Chevrolet. He turned back to Greg. "You shouldn't have come here, son," Calvin said. He raised the red-handled crowbar, his shoulder slumping as he shifted his weight to his good hip, his knuckles white against the steel. Mitchell took a step forward, his hands open, his face bloodless. "Calvin, stop! He's just a kid. He didn't do anything." "He's the one who brought the inspector, Mitchell," Calvin said, his voice flat, his eyes fixed on Greg's yellow slicker. "He's the one who's going to put you on the state farm." Greg looked at the crowbar. He took 2 steps backward up the stone stairs, his flashlight beam shaking so violently it looked like a strobe light against the fieldstone. "Lorraine?" he screamed. "Lorraine, please!" I stood up from the coal bin. I reached into my apron pocket and pulled out the old skeleton key, its rusted iron loop cold against my palm. "Calvin," I said. He didn't look at me. He took another step toward Greg, the crowbar raised to the level of his chest. "I didn't call the bank this morning, Cal," I said. "I didn't call the bank, Cal," I repeated. My voice was no louder than the sound of the rain dripping from the cellar hatch, but it made Calvin freeze. The crowbar in his hand stayed raised, but his shoulder sank slightly, the tip of the steel bar tilting toward the gravel. He turned his head, his pale eyes searching my face in the dim, shaky light of Greg's flashlight. "What do you mean?" he asked. "I didn't have to call them," I said. "They called me 3 weeks ago, when you first tried to increase the credit line on the second mortgage. They wanted to know why my signature didn't match the one on the original deed from my father." Calvin's mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. "I told them to let you think the loan was going through," I said. "I told them I was working with the county auditor's office to trace some other discrepancies in our property tax records. They've been watching our accounts for a month, Calvin. Every deposit from Roy's garage, every check you wrote to your sister's trailer park." "Mom?" Mitchell whispered. He was still standing by the cedar post, his hands shaking, his voice like a child's after a bad dream. "You knew? For a month?" "I knew," I said, looking at my son. "I had to wait, Mitchell. I had to wait until you decided whose side of the bed you were going to sleep on. I had to wait until you realized that Calvin wasn't trying to save this house. He was just using your back to carry the wood out." I turned back to Greg, who was still standing on the stone steps, his yellow slicker shining in the damp light. "I sent you those emails at noon, Greg," I said softly. "The scans of the real Sunday logs, the ones I kept in my mother's china hutch. I didn't want you to think I had stolen from the store. I wanted you to have the proof before the inspector arrived." Greg's flashlight beam finally stopped shaking. He lowered it, the white circle of light pooling around his wet boots on the stone. "I got them, Lorraine," he said, his voice dropping into a quiet, trembling relief. "I saw the signatures. They weren't yours. The L didn't have the hook." "No," I said, "it didn't." When you spend 30 years observing in silence, you learn how to build a fire that only burns the wood you want to get rid of. I hadn't spent those weeks crying or begging. I had spent them copying ledgers, matching signatures, and mailing envelopes to the county prosecutor's office from the post office 2 towns over, where no one knew my name. Calvin let the crowbar slide. It hit the gravel floor with a soft, heavy thud, rolling twice before coming to a stop near Mitchell's boots. "You played me," Calvin said. His voice was very quiet, very dry. He looked older now than he ever had, his broad shoulders hunched, his chin trembling slightly under his gray stubble. "You sat at that table, you made my coffee, you washed my clothes, and you were putting me in a cage." "I was just cleaning the house, Calvin," I said, sitting back down on the gray timber of the coal bin. "You're the one who brought the dirt in." "What about Mitchell?" Calvin asked, his eyes flickering toward my son. He tried to reach for his old weapon, the last card he had left to play. "He signed those bank papers. He moved the scrap. If they take me, they take him." "No, they won't," I said. Mitchell looked up, his face pale and wet. "Mitchell's signature on the default notices is a forgery too, Cal," I said. The cellar went completely silent. The only sound was the steady, heavy pat, pat, pat of the rain against the iron doors. "You thought Mitchell was helping you because he wanted to," I said to Calvin. "But he was only doing it because he was scared of you. So I signed his name on those default notices myself. I used the same neat, small hand the nuns taught him at St. Jude's. I made sure the bank's fraud investigator would see that both of our names had been written by the same hand, yours." Mitchell let out a long, ragged breath and fell to his knees on the gravel floor, his face buried in his wet sleeves. He wasn't crying, he was just breathing, his shoulders rising and falling, as if a heavy stone had finally been rolled off his chest. Calvin stared at me. For the first time in 12 years, there was no smile on his face, no dry remark about the garden or the gutters. There was only a cold, hollow vacuum. "You're a hard woman, Lorraine," he said. "I'm just tired, Cal," I said, folding my hands back into my apron. "I've been tired for 30 years. Above us, past the wet birch trees and the overgrown blackberry bushes, the blue and red lights of the county sheriff's cruisers began to flash through the high cellar window. They didn't have their sirens on. They didn't need them. The lane was narrow, and they knew exactly where the house was. Greg stood on the steps, his yellow slicker reflecting the blue light as it crept down the stone. He looked down at Mitchell, then at Calvin, and finally at me. "Lorraine," Greg said quietly, "they're here." I didn't get up. I sat on the coal bin in the damp, cold dark, watching the red and blue lights paint the fieldstone walls of my father's cellar. The handcuffs went on with 2 sharp, metallic clicks that sounded remarkably like the latches on the black shipping crates. Deputy Wayne, an older man with gray hair who had gone to school with Calvin back when the valley was still mostly orchards, didn't use any force. He didn't have to. Calvin stood perfectly still, his wrists held out behind his back, his head slightly bowed as Wayne adjusted the steel cuffs over his heavy leather work gloves. "Watch the step, Cal," Wayne said softly, his hand resting gently on Calvin's shoulder as they began the slow, halting climb up the stone stairs. The rains made the moss slick. Calvin didn't look back at me. He didn't look at Mitchell, who was still sitting on the gravel floor with his back against the coal bin, his face buried in his hands. Calvin's boots just made that same dry, dragging thump click on the fieldstone until the yellow light of the hatch swallowed him, leaving only the sound of the rain and the steady, blue sweep of the cruiser's lights through the cellar window. Greg went up next. He had turned his flashlight off, the yellow slicker now gray in the dim light of the hallway above. He stopped at the top of the stairs, looking down at me one last time, his face small and white under his baseball cap. "I have to go to the station to sign the statement, Lorraine," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Deputy Wayne said you can stay here tonight, but he needs you down at the courthouse by 9 tomorrow." "I'll be there, Greg," I said. "Thank you for the tea." He didn't know what to say to that. He just nodded, his hood rustling as he turned and let the pantry door click shut behind him. And then it was just me and Mitchell. The silence of the cellar was heavy now, stripped of the mechanical vibration of Roy's truck and the dry rattle of Calvin's breathing. I stood up from the coal bin, my knees stiff from the cold, and wiped a layer of white lime dust from my apron. "Let's go up, Mitchell," I said, reaching down to touch his wet shoulder. "The stove is still on." He didn't move for a long time. Then, slowly, he pushed himself up from the gravel, his joints popping in the quiet. He looked at me, his eyes red-rimmed and hollow, his mouth dry. He looked like a stranger, but he also looked exactly like the 15-year-old boy who used to sit on the porch swing after his father died, waiting for someone to tell him it was okay to come inside. "How long, Mom?" he asked, his voice cracked. "How long did you know about the signatures?" "Since the spring," I said, walking toward the pantry stairs. "When the bank first sent the verification card. I've been keeping the duplicates in the china hutch." "You could have stopped him then," Mitchell said. He followed me up the narrow wooden steps, his boots heavy behind mine. "Before the copper, before the safe, you could have saved us all the trouble." "If I had stopped him then, Mitchell," I said, pushing the pantry door open and stepping into the warm kitchen, "you would have just found another man to carry the wire for. You had to see him leave you behind. You had to realize that some men only love you for the weight you can carry. A mother can save her child from the wolves, but in doing so, she has to let him see the teeth she kept hidden behind her smiles. And once he sees them, he never quite looks at her the same way again." Mitchell looked at me now as if he were waiting for me to bite. He sat down at the kitchen table, his hands tucked between his knees, his shoulders hunched as if he were trying to occupy as little space as possible in my clean, quiet house. I walked over to the stove. The pot of potatoes had boiled dry, a thick black crust of burnt starch sticking to the bottom of the aluminum pot, filling the kitchen with a bitter, scorched smell. I turned off the burner, lifted the heavy pot with a dish towel, and set it in the sink. The water from the faucet hissed as it hit the hot metal, a gray cloud of steam rising up to fog the window. "The bank's going to take the house anyway, isn't it?" Mitchell asked. He was staring at the small blue tin of garden tags that still sat in the center of the oilcloth table. "The 12,000. Calvin said it's gone." "Calvin said a lot of things, Mitchell," I said, drying my hands on the tea towel. I walked over to the table and picked up the blue tin. I opened the lid, tipped the rusty nails and the green plastic tags onto the oilcloth, and reached down to the bottom of the tin. There was a small, white piece of paper folded into a tight square, no larger than a postage stamp, stuck to the underside of the lid with a piece of yellowed cellophane tape. I peeled it off and unfolded it. It was a deposit receipt from the county credit union, dated November 3rd, the same day Mitchell's neat, small signature had supposedly been written on the default notice. The amount was $12,000. But the name on the account wasn't Calvin's, and it wasn't mine. It was Mitchell Vance. I set the paper on the table, right next to Mitchell's wet fingers. "Calvin didn't empty the account, Mitchell," I said, my voice dropping into a quiet, chilling register. "He couldn't. It required 2 signatures to withdraw anything over $5,000. He was waiting for you to sign the clearance papers tonight, after the copper was loaded." Mitchell stared at the paper, His mouth opened, his chest rising in a quick, ragged gasp. He put it in my name? He put it in your name so the bank would see you as the primary debtor if the mortgage failed, I said. But he forgot one thing. What? Mitchell whispered. I'm still your mother, I said, looking at the small, blue-lined ledger on the hutch. And your father's name is still on the original trust. The credit union can't release those funds to the bank without my consent, because the land was never Calvin's to borrow against in the first place. Mitchell looked from the paper to my face, his eyes wide with a slow, creeping horror that was far deeper than the fear he'd had of Calvin's crowbar. He was beginning to realize that the house hadn't been saved by a miracle. It had been saved by a woman who had spent 30 years learning how to negotiate with the dark. "What are you going to do with it, Mom?" he asked, his voice barely a breath. I didn't answer. I reached out, picked up the paring knife from the counter, and slid it back into the wooden block by the stove with a soft, clean schloop. "Go wash your hands, Mitchell," I said. "The potatoes are burned, but I've still got some cold ham in the cellar." The cellar was different without Calvin's boots on the stairs. I went down the narrow wooden steps alone, my phone's light guiding me past the empty space where the black shipping crates had sat for 3 years. The smell of kerosene and industrial solder was still there, but it was fading, replaced by the damp, clean scent of the fieldstone walls after a heavy rain. At the bottom of the stairs, my light caught the red-handled crowbar lying on the gravel. I reached down, my fingers closing around the cold steel, and stood it upright against the cedar support post. It felt surprisingly light now that it wasn't being pointed at anyone. I walked over to the old earthenware crock by the coal bin, lifted the heavy slate lid, and took out the cold, salt-cured ham I'd put down in October. I wrapped it in a clean piece of cheesecloth, my hands steady, and climbed back up to the kitchen. Mitchell was still sitting at the table, his hands wet and smelling of the carbolic soap from the sink. He didn't look up as I set the ham on the cutting board and took the carving knife from the drawer. "You're going to tell Wayne about Roy's truck, aren't you?" Mitchell asked. His voice was flat, the panic of the evening replaced by a dull, gray exhaustion. "I already did, Mitchell," I said, slicing the pink meat into thin, translucent ribbons. "Before they came to the house. I gave Wayne the license plate of the flatbed and the key code for the equipment shed fence." Mitchell's fingers tightened on the edge of the oilcloth. "Roy's been a friend of this family since I was a boy, Mom. He gave me my first set of wrenches. He bought your father's old tools from Calvin for $40 3 weeks after the funeral, Mitchell," I said, not looking at him. "And then he sold them back to you for $80 when you turned 18. He wasn't a friend. He was just a man who knew how to buy things cheap from people who were hurting. When you decide to pull the thread on a family secret, you have to be prepared for the entire blanket to unravel. You can't choose which parts of the rot to keep and which parts to throw away. Calvin had spent 12 years building a web of small, grease-stained debts in this valley, and Roy was just one of the spiders sitting in the corner, waiting for his turn to eat. "What about Warren?" Mitchell asked. "He's the county foreman. He's the one who let Calvin have the maps of the inactive rail lines." "Warren's wife is Greg's aunt," I said, sliding the sliced ham onto a yellow stoneware plate. "She's the one who told me Warren was buying a new pontoon boat with cash last month. The county attorney's already got his ledger." Mitchell looked at me, his mouth opening slightly as the scale of the collapse finally sank in. He had spent 12 years believing he was part of a small, desperate circle of men who were doing what they had to do to survive. He had never realized that the circle was actually a spiral, and his mother had been standing at the center of it with a pair of shears, waiting for the rope to get tight enough. "You're not going to leave anything standing, are you?" he whispered. "Only what belongs to us, Mitchell," I said, setting the plate of ham and a loaf of brown bread on the table. Eat. You have to be clean by 9. Saturday morning came with a pale, watery sun that did nothing to warm the kitchen. I wore my good navy blue wool coat, the one I'd bought for my father's funeral and only wore to church and weddings. My hair was pinned back, neat and tight, and my pharmacy shoes had been wiped clean of the cellar lime. Mitchell sat in the passenger seat of my old sedan, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, his chin tucked into the collar of his clean denim jacket. He hadn't spoken since we left the kitchen. As we pulled out of the driveway, the tires crunching on the wet gravel, I looked back at the house. It looked different in the morning light. Smaller, gray, like an old bird that had lost its feathers. The roof was still leaking, the wood around the gutters still rotting, but the mortgage was current, and Calvin's name was no longer on the registry at the county courthouse. We drove down the river road, the water brown and swollen from the night's rain, carrying dead branches and yellow leaves toward the valley. When we passed the old equipment shed near the concrete bridge, the yellow sheriff's tape was already wrapped around the chain-link fence. Roy's flatbed was gone, replaced by a gray county tow truck that was idling in the mud, its amber light rotating silently in the fog. But as the sedan slowed to take the curve by the old quarry, I saw something else. A black Ford sedan, not a sheriff's cruiser, was parked in the gravel pull-off near the birch grove. A man in a dark canvas coat was standing by the fender, his hands in his pockets, his hat pulled down against the mist. He didn't look like a deputy. He didn't look like anyone from the valley. As we passed, his head turned slowly, his eyes tracking our car through the wet glass of our windshield. He didn't wave, and he didn't move. He just stood there, his face shadowed, watching the two of us drive toward the county seat. Mitchell saw him too. He shifted in his seat, his hand reaching instinctively for the door handle before he remembered where we were going. "Mom," Mitchell said, his voice dropping into a low, tense whisper. "That's the guy from the terminal, the buyer from Tucson." "I know," I said, keeping my hands steady on the wheel. "He's been waiting at the crossing since 7. "He's going to want his money, Mom," Mitchell said, his shoulder pressing against the door. "The 12,000. He thinks we have it." "He can want whatever he likes, Mitchell," I said, accelerating as we hit the county blacktop. "But he's 70 miles from home, and the sheriff is waiting for us at the courthouse." I looked in the rearview mirror. The black car didn't pull out of the gravel. It remained standing under the birch trees, its headlights off, slowly disappearing into the gray wool of the river fog. The county courthouse in the county seat was a gray sandstone building that smelled of 100-year-old pine floor wax, wet wool, and the dry metallic rattle of the steam radiators. Deputy Wayne guided us through the heavy double doors into the basement, where the county prosecutor's office sat behind a frosted glass partition. The light down here was yellow and flat, hummed by the same fluorescent tubes that made my head ache at the pharmacy. We were met by Assistant Prosecutor Keith, a sharp, clean-shaven young man who wore his gray suit with the stiff, self-conscious neatness of a boy who had just graduated from the state university. He looked at me with a polite, slightly patronizing pity, the way young lawyers look at old women who have been left behind by their husbands. "Mrs. Vance," Keith said, pulling out a heavy oak chair for me, "I've reviewed the mortgage documents you provided to Deputy Wayne. The signatures are indeed inconsistent. We'll need your formal statement regarding the dates of the transactions, and then we'll have the county sheriff's office handle the signature verification with the bank." "I have the ledger here," I said, setting my purse on the oak table and pulling out the small, blue-lined notebook where I'd recorded Calvin's bank deposits. "It matches the dates of the deliveries to the equipment yard." Keith took the book, his fingers turning the pages with a dry, whispering slide. "This is very thorough, Mrs. Vance. Most people in your position, well, they don't keep such detailed records. When you spend 20 years counting 60-milligram tablets, Mr. Keith," I said, "you learn to notice when one is missing." As we walked out of the office to wait for Mitchell's statement to be typed, I saw Calvin. He was sitting on a heavy oak bench at the far end of the hallway, handcuffed to a steel ring set into the sandstone wall. He was still wearing his gray canvas work trousers, but they'd taken his belt and his boots, replacing them with a pair of paper-thin orange slippers from the county jail. He looked smaller, his broad shoulders slumping forward, his bad hip cocked at an awkward, painful angle. He didn't look at Mitchell as we passed. He looked straight at me. "Lorraine," he said. His voice was very quiet, very dry, the gravelly rattle of his throat sounding like a shovel dragging on stone. Deputy Wayne, who was standing by the door of the sheriff's office, took a step forward, but I held up my hand. I walked over to the bench and stood 3 feet from him, my navy blue wool coat buttoned to my throat, my hands tucked into my pockets. "You think you're safe because you kept your hands clean, Lorraine?" Calvin asked. He didn't sound angry. He sounded patient, the way he used to look when he was waiting for the glue on a broken chair leg to dry. "You think you've cleared the house?" "The house is clear, Calvin," I said. Calvin let out that short, dry breath from his nose. "The buyer from Tucson isn't from Tucson, Lorraine. He's the delivery driver for the state pharmacy distributor, the one who brings the blue boxes to your store every Tuesday morning." My chest went cold. "He's the one who told me which weeks the inventory counts were low," Calvin whispered, his handcuffs making a small metallic clink against the sandstone wall as he leaned forward. "He's the one who gave me the key to the back door of your store. He didn't want the copper, Lorraine. He wanted the morphine because his people in the city were paying 4 times what the local clinic was. He's been in your back room while you were at the counter." I stood perfectly still, the blue light of the corridor radiators humming in my ears. "Ask Greg who signed for the Tuesday delivery after you left at noon," Calvin said, his lips curving into that dry, tiny smile. "Ask him who held the clipboard." We left the courthouse at noon. The rain had started again, a cold, thin drizzle that turned the sandstone steps of the building into slate-gray mirrors. Mitchell walked beside me, his head down, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. He was shaking, his teeth clicking together in the cold. "Mom," he said as we reached the car, "what did he say to you?" "He told me we're not going home tonight, Mitchell," I said, pulling my keys from my pocket. My fingers were cold, but they didn't shake. "We're going to the pharmacy." "Why?" Mitchell asked, his hand hovering over the passenger door handle. "Wayne said we're done for the day." "We're not done," I said. "We think we are cleaning our house by throwing the trash out the front door, only to realize the wind is blowing it right back through the kitchen window." I had spent weeks tracing Calvin's bank deposits, matching them to Mitchell's deliveries, believing the rot was contained to my husband and my son. I had never looked at the delivery driver. I had never looked at the blue shipping crates that came from the state warehouse every Tuesday morning, because they were part of the routine, the invisible background of my 20 years at the counter. We drove back down the county highway, the windshield wipers making a dry, rhythmic slap-slap against the wet glass. When we reached the town, the streets were empty, the gray gravel of the parking lot outside the pharmacy slick with puddles. The closed sign was turned to the street, the heavy iron security gate pulled across the front windows. But the lights in the back room were on. Through the narrow pane of the side door, the door Calvin said the delivery driver had the key to, I could see a yellow rectangle of light falling across the concrete floor of the stockroom. And sitting in the middle of that yellow light was a single blue plastic shipping crate, its lid open, its white packing foam scattered across the floor like dry bone. A shadow moved across the window. It wasn't Greg's light, quick frame. It was broader, heavier, the shoulder slumping to the left in a way I had seen every Tuesday morning for 5 years. It was the driver, and he was still inside. The key turned in the brass cylinder of the pharmacy's back door with a soft, clean click that was swallowed by the hum of the air handling unit. I pushed the heavy steel door open, stepping from the cold river drizzle into the narrow, fluorescent-lit stockroom. The air in here smelled of cardboard, isopropyl alcohol, and the faint, sweet scent of the vanilla floor cleaner we used on Friday nights. "Mom," Mitchell whispered behind me. His hand was on my sleeve, his fingers twitching against the wool of my navy coat. "We shouldn't be in here. We should call Wayne. He's only 30 minutes back." "Wayne is 30 minutes back, Mitchell," I said, my voice steady, my eyes fixed on the yellow light of the shipping alcove. "By the time he gets here, Greg will be the only one left in the building, and the state inspector will have his name on the warrant." I didn't wait for him to answer. I walked past the tall wire shelves where the bulk bottles of saline and cough syrup were stacked, my pharmacy shoes silent on the clean linoleum. When I reached the edge of the alcove, I stopped. Patrick, the delivery driver, was standing by the high steel packing table. He was still wearing his gray linen uniform jacket with the state seal on the pocket, but his sleeves were rolled up, exposing the thick, pale hair on his forearms. He was transferring the small amber glass bottles of liquid morphine from the blue shipping crate into a black canvas duffel bag. Greg was sitting on a low plastic step stool in the corner, his back pressed against the metal shelving. His wrists were bound behind his back with 2 heavy black plastic zip ties, the thick nylon cutting into the skin of his forearms. He had a small dark smear of grease across his forehead, and his baseball cap lay on the floor between his feet like a dead bird. "Patrick," I said. Patrick didn't flinch. He didn't drop the bottle he was holding. He set it slowly into the black canvas bag, zipped the heavy brass zipper, and turned to face me. His broad, flat face was completely dry, his gray eyes steady under his heavy brows. "Lorraine," he said. His voice was a low, slow rumble, the same tone he used when he told me the Tuesday shipment was 3 cases short because of the ice on the pass. "You shouldn't have come back. The boy at the courthouse said you were going to stay in town for the night." "The boy at the courthouse doesn't know my routine, Patrick," I said, my hands still tucked into my coat pockets. "I've been locking this door at 6 o'clock every Saturday for 20 years. "Mom," Mitchell said, stepping into the alcove behind me. He looked at Greg, then at the black duffel bag on the table, his face turning the color of wet lime. "We have to go." "Nobody's going anywhere, Mitchell," Patrick said. He didn't reach for a weapon, and he didn't raise his voice. He just leaned his heavy hip against the packing table, his hand resting casually on the strap of the duffel bag. "Your stepfather's already in the county jail. Roy's flatbed is at the sheriff's yard. The whole valley is falling apart, and you're standing here with your mother's keys, trying to play the hero. A quiet workplace is just a theater where everyone pretends to follow the rules, while underneath, the foundation is being eaten away by the same small compromises we make to survive the week." I had worked with Patrick for 5 years. I had signed his clipboards, offered him cups of coffee when the roads were bad, and listened to him talk about his daughter's dental bills. I had never realized that his daughter's teeth had been paid for by the blue boxes he was carrying out in his truck. "Calvin's already going down for the forgery, Lorraine," Patrick said, his eyes tracking the movement of my hands inside my coat. "And the state police have Roy's ledger. If I walk out of here with this bag, the state inspector will find the safe empty on Wednesday, and the sheriff will assume Calvin took the morphine before he was arrested. Calvin's 64. His hip is shot. He'll die in the state farm anyway. He took a step toward me, his heavy boots making a soft, greasy creak on the floor. "Let him take the fall," Patrick whispered. "He's the one who built the trap. You keep the house. Mitchell stays out of the orange jumpsuit, and Greg here, well, Greg goes home to his aunt, with nothing but a couple of red marks on his wrists." It was a perfect, quiet trade. One old man's final years in exchange for the survival of my family. I looked at Greg, his face pale and wet, his eyes begging me to say yes. I looked at Mitchell, my only child, who was standing beside me, shivering in the clean kitchen of his mother's silence. "It's a good deal, Lorraine," Patrick said. I looked down at my hand inside my pocket. My fingers were curled around the heavy, rusted loop of the duplicate skeleton key. "It's a good deal, Patrick," I said, "but you forgot one thing." Before he could answer, the heavy steel door behind us, the one I had just locked, rattled. Someone was trying the latch from the outside, not with a key, but with the slow, heavy pressure of a crowbar being wedged into the casing. The steel door gave a loud, metallic crack as the lock cylinder sheared. A cold gust of river air swept into the stockroom, carrying the smell of wet asphalt and dead leaves. The door swung open, and Gentry, the man from the black Ford sedan, stepped inside. He was wearing his dark canvas coat, the shoulders slick with rain, his hat pulled down so low his eyes were mostly shadow. He didn't have a weapon in his hand, but his right hand was shoved deep into his pocket, the fabric stretched tight over something heavy and angular. He looked around the yellow-lit stockroom with a slow, dry deliberation, his eyes stopping on Patrick, then Greg, and finally on Mitchell, who had stepped back against the packing table. "Patrick," Gentry said. His voice was very quiet, very flat, with the clean, municipal accent of a man who spent his days in city offices. "You're 40 minutes late. The crossing guy said you weren't answering your radio." "We had an interruption, Gentry," Patrick said, his hand still resting on the strap of the black duffel bag. He didn't look at Gentry's pocket. He looked at the floor, his broad face graying under the fluorescent light. Lorraine came back. Gentry looked at me. He took 2 steps forward, his wet boots leaving 2 dark, greasy tracks on the clean linoleum. He didn't look like a criminal. He looked like a state health inspector or a county assessor, the kind of man who brings a clipboard and a blue pen to tell you your barn is 3 inches too close to the road. "Mrs. Vance," Gentry said, giving me a small, polite nod. "Your husband told me you were a quiet woman. He said you spent most of your time with the garden." "The garden is dead, Mr. Gentry," I said, my hands still tucked into my navy wool coat. "The frost took it on Tuesday." "That's a shame," he said. He turned his eyes slowly to Mitchell, who was standing by the table, his shoulders hunched, his chin trembling in his collar. "Vance, where is the 12,000? "I don't have it," Mitchell said, his voice cracking. "I swear to God, I don't. Calvin put it in the credit union. My mom has the paper." Gentry looked back at me, his hands still heavy in his coat pocket. "Is that true, Mrs. Vance? You have the paper?" "I have the deposit receipt, Mr. Gentry," I said, "and the trust documents that control the account. But the credit union is closed until Monday morning." "The credit union is a state building, Mrs. Vance," Gentry said, his voice dropping into a low, dry murmur that was almost lost in the hum of the heater. "They don't like to release funds that have been flagged by the county prosecutor, and since your husband's already in the jail, I don't think they'll be letting you sign for anything before the trial." A mother spends her life trying to keep her son from being taken by his own mistakes, only to realize the world doesn't care about his mistakes. It only cares about what he owes. Gentry didn't care about Calvin's forgery, and he didn't care about my 20 years at the counter. He cared about the $12,000 his people in the city had paid for the morphine, and he wasn't going to drive back down the river road empty-handed. "We'll take the bag, Patrick," Gentry said, not looking at him, "and we'll take the kid." "Gentry, no," Patrick said, his voice rising slightly. "The sheriff's already got the flatbed. If you take the kid—" "The sheriff has the flatbed, Patrick, but he doesn't have the delivery log," Gentry said, his gray eyes coming back to my face. "And since Mrs. Vance here is so good with the signatures, I'm sure she'll understand why we need some collateral while the bank handles the verification." Mitchell's hand reached out, his fingers brushing my sleeve, his face completely bloodless. "Mom," he whispered, "Mom, please." I reached into my pocket and pulled out the small white piece of paper, the credit union deposit receipt I'd taken from the blue tin. I held it out between my fingers, my hands steady, my eyes fixed on the shadow of Gentry's hat. "You want the $12,000, Gentry?" I asked. "It's in the county credit union. The account is flagged, but it's not locked. The only way to release those funds without a court order is with my signature as the co-signer of the original trust." Gentry looked at the paper, then at my face. "You'll sign it over to us?" "I'll sign it over to the bank as restitution for the second mortgage, Gentry," I said, my voice cold and flat as a slate shingle. "If Mitchell stays here. But if you take him out of this room, I'll walk down to the sheriff's office and sign the confession myself. I'll tell Wayne I took the $12,000 and hid it in the garden. I'll make sure the state police lock the account as evidence before the sun comes up." Gentry's eyes narrowed. He stood in the middle of the stockroom, the wet asphalt of his coat smelling of the river, his hands still heavy in his pocket. He was a practical man, a middleman who calculated risk the way a mechanic calculates torque. He knew that a dead old woman couldn't sign a release, and a missing boy would only bring more deputies down the river road than his people in the city could buy. "You're a very stubborn woman, Mrs. Vance," he said. "I'm just a mother, Mr. Gentry," I said, "and my son has already carried enough of your wood." Above us, past the broken latch of the back door, the sound of a siren rose through the fog. It was far away, near the concrete bridge, but it was coming toward the town, the high, rhythmic whine cutting through the quiet of the river road. Gentry looked at the door. He looked at Patrick, then at the black duffel bag on the table, his mouth tightening into a thin gray line. "The siren," Mitchell whispered. "That's Wayne." Gentry looked at the small white paper in my hand, then at the open back door where the cold river rain was blowing inside, pooling on the clean linoleum. The siren was louder now, climbing the long, steep hill by the Methodist cemetery. In 3 minutes, the first cruiser would clear the tree line and block the only gravel lane leading out of the pharmacy lot. "You're a very expensive family to do business with, Patrick," Gentry said. He didn't reach for the black duffel bag on the table. He didn't look at Mitchell again. He simply stepped backward, his wet canvas coat rustling as he vanished into the dark, wet night. The steel back door swung in the wind, its broken latch clicking against the frame with a dry, rhythmic sound. Patrick stood by the table, his face completely hollow. He looked at the duffel bag, then at Greg, and finally at me. He knew his state truck was parked out front. He knew his license plate was on every delivery log in the county. He didn't try to run. He slowly sat down on the edge of the packing table, his shoulders slumping, his hands falling limp between his knees. I walked over to the table, picked up a gray utility knife from the tape dispenser, and walked over to Greg. My hands were steady as I slid the blade through the black plastic zip ties on his wrists. They snapped with 2 sharp, clean clicks. Greg didn't stand up. He just stayed on the stool, rubbing his red, swollen wrists, his eyes wet with a young man's quiet, exhausted tears. "Thank you, Lorraine," he whispered. "Go wash your face, Greg," I said softly. "The sheriff's going to have a lot of questions, and you need to look like you're ready to answer them." The white headlights of Deputy Wayne's cruiser swept across the high stockroom windows, casting long, moving shadows across the wire shelves. The siren died with a low, gurgling sigh, leaving only the steady hum of the heater and the sound of the rain on the steel roof. Spring came late to the valley that year. The mud stayed in the pastures until May, and the creek behind the house ran brown and thick with winter runoff, carrying the dead blackberry brambles and rotted pine limbs down to the river. The house was sold. It went to a young couple from the county seat who wanted the acreage for their horses. They didn't care about the willow pattern wallpaper in the dining room, and they didn't care about the old fieldstone cellar. They were going to bulldoze the old pine shed by June to build a new metal barn. Mitchell helped me load the last of the cardboard boxes into the trunk of my old sedan. He was living in a small apartment above the hardware store in town now, working the register. He had his own keys, his own bills, and his own silence. We didn't talk about Calvin. The county court had sentenced him to 6 years at the state farm for the forgery and the state utility thefts, and his sister in Tucson had never called the house. I didn't give Mitchell the $12,000. I had used $8,000 of it to clear the second mortgage before the sale, and the rest went into a restricted trust for his future, an account he couldn't touch until he was 40, no matter how heavy the wood got. We stood on the back porch, the gravel driveway empty, the sky a pale, clean blue that smelled of damp earth and wild onions. "Where are you going, Mom?" Mitchell asked, his hand resting on the strap of his canvas duffel bag. He looked smaller today, but he also looked lighter, as if his shoulders had finally adjusted to the empty space where his stepfather's weight used to be. "I've got a small apartment near the park," I said, putting my car keys in my pocket. "It's on the 2nd floor. It's got 3 windows that get the morning light." He looked at the empty house, his eyes tracking the peeling paint around the kitchen window. "You spent 30 years holding this place together, Mom." "I did," I said. I looked at my son, and for the first time in his life, he didn't look like he was waiting for me to step between him and the world. He looked at me and saw a woman who was finally allowed to rest. "But nobody was holding me, Mitchell," I said, "and it's time I let the walls go." I turned, walked down the wooden steps to my car, and drove down the river road, not looking back at the dust we left behind.